This episode is called Dark Killer. In the summer of 1998, 32-year-old Katherine Gordon sat curled up on the couch with a book inside of her home in Atlanta, Georgia. Across the living room, her husband lifted their newborn baby, Jade, out of the bassinet and carried her toward Katherine to breastfeed. It should have been a sweet moment. Katherine thought about how amazing it was that she actually had a baby. It wasn't that long ago that she was a self-described party girl who thought more about the next bikini contest she could enter than about having a child of her own. But now, the former model who once moonlighted as a bartender was a stay-at-home mother with a husband in law school. They were now the model of respectability, and their little baby Jade completed their perfect little family. But Katherine didn't think being a mom would hurt so much. Every time Jade latched onto her breast for milk, Katherine felt a burning sensation tear through her chest. It hurt so much she could feel tears welling up in her eyes. Her husband, John, had tried to reassure her that a lot of new moms experienced difficulties with breastfeeding, and Katherine wanted to believe him. Maybe she was still learning how to do it right. Katherine cupped her hand around the soft, warm fuzz of Jade's head and guided her from John's hands to her breast. The baby tilted her face up to stare at her mother as she began to nurse. Katherine started to smile at Jade's big round eyes, but then she noticed her baby's lips. They were bright red, covered in blood. A bolt of fear shot through Katherine, and she pulled Jade off her breast to get a closer look. It didn't look like the blood was coming from Jade's mouth. Instead, it seemed to be coming from Katherine's milk ducts. She was relieved the baby was okay, but what in the world was going on with her? She called for John and jumped up from the couch to hand him their baby. Then she called her doctor and said she needed an appointment right away. The nurse said she could squeeze her in the next day. By the next morning, Katherine was exhausted. She'd barely slept the night before, between waking up for the baby and also worrying about what was happening with her breasts. If it wasn't for the pain in her chest, she might have fallen asleep right there. But her doctor, the same OBGYN who had delivered Jade a month earlier, could not have been kinder. She asked Katherine questions about her pain and carefully examined her breast to pinpoint where the pain was coming from. She also had Katherine produce some milk for analysis in the lab. Then she smiled and explained that Katherine had mastitis, a bacterial infection that targets breast tissue, causing it to swell. The swelling put pressure on Katherine's milk ducts, which led to the pain Katherine felt when she fed Jade. It also led to the bleeding. Mastitis is a very common illness that affects many new mothers, and it's easy to fix with antibiotics. The doctor promised that once Katherine finished taking the medication for 10 days, she'd be back to normal. Katherine exhaled in relief. But something was still bothering her that she needed to share. She told the doctor that 10 years ago, she had gotten breast implants while she was working as a swimwear model in Virginia Beach, Virginia. At the time, Katherine had been excited to get them. They gave her such a full figure that she won beauty contests all over the region. But now, Katherine wondered if the procedure could have caused any problems with breastfeeding her baby. The doctor promised Katherine the infection had nothing to do with the implants. This seemed like a totally ordinary case of mastitis, and she was sure Katherine would feel better after taking the antibiotics. Katherine thanked the doctor and headed home to tell John, hopeful that she would soon feel better. Three days after Katherine finished her course of antibiotics for her mastitis, she and John sat down to a big meal that she'd prepared. Katherine was feeling great and had put Jade down to sleep with no problems earlier in the evening. The antibiotics had taken away all the pain from breastfeeding, and she'd even felt good enough to go to the gym earlier in the week. It was rare these days that Katherine and John got to spend time alone, and now John was very eager to tell his wife about his busy day. Besides attending law school, John also managed a chain of restaurants and bars, so he was juggling a lot. He had always been a type A personality, never satisfied unless he had a new challenge. Katherine had worked hard too, both as a model and then also a sales rep, but now she was content to look after their home and be with the baby. She sometimes thought that there was something a little invisible about being a stay-at-home mom, but she still cherished this time with Jade, even if she did sometimes feel like she was just her husband's cheerleader. A few minutes into dinner, Catherine began to feel extremely tired. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was only 8 o'clock, and normally she was still full of energy at this time. She tried her best to ignore the fatigue and concentrated as best as she could on what John was saying about his constitutional law class. She told herself that, long days with Jade were exhausting, and probably she just needed more sleep. But when Catherine and John finished eating their meals and they stood up to clear the table, Catherine felt so lightheaded that she immediately sat back down before she fell. As she sat there collecting herself, Catherine realized that her muscles were beginning to ache too. And so she hoped she wasn't now coming down with the flu right when she was finally cured of mastitis. John rushed over to her and asked her what was wrong. Catherine didn't want to alarm him, so she smiled and said she was just tired. He squeezed her hand and told her he would clean up. She should just go to bed and get some rest. Catherine nodded and slowly got up and walked to the bedroom, hoping she'd feel back to normal in the morning. A month later, Catherine limped back into the waiting room of her OBGYN's office. She had tried for weeks to get better on her own, hoping that her healthy eating habits and drinking lots of fresh juice would speed up her recovery, but no matter what she did, it didn't help. She just kept getting worse. These days, her fatigue and aching muscles were making it so hard to get out of bed in the morning, and recently her joints had started to feel hot and tender. Catherine now relied on a group of friends to help her care for the baby all day and make meals, while John started handling more of the house cleaning and Jade's nightly feedings. Catherine felt so guilty. She knew that her mysterious symptoms were making John's life way harder and kind of testing his patience. John was trying to be a good husband and help out around the house, but Catherine found it impossible to keep from criticizing him when he left a dirty dish in the sink or a paper out of place. Catherine couldn't help that she was a perfectionist, and she knew it totally grated on him when she asked so much of him while saying that she was just too tired and achy to keep the house organized herself. Catherine knew something was wrong, and it probably was not mastitis. She was hoping the doctor could help her figure out what was really wrong so she could start feeling like herself again. As Catherine sat on the examining table in her hospital gown, the doctor flipped through the pages of her medical chart and told her what she saw. Catherine's vital signs were normal. Her blood work was normal. She didn't have a major disease like cancer or heart disease, and she didn't have a minor one like mastitis either. In fact, as far as the doctor could see, there was nothing physically wrong with Catherine at all. Then she asked Catherine how she was feeling mentally and if everything was all right at home. Catherine admitted that things were a bit tense these days between her and John, and she explained that her fatigue was making it really hard to take care of her baby. The doctor's expression grew serious, and she sat down next to Catherine. She suspected that her fatigue was due to postpartum depression, a condition that often afflicts new mothers and can be treated with counseling or antidepressants. Catherine was stunned. She did not feel depressed. If she was struggling emotionally, it was only because of her physical discomfort, not the other way around. She told the doctor that when she looked down at Jade and saw her baby smile, she knew that Jade was the best thing in her life. She just needed to get back in good physical shape so she could be the mother she always wanted to be. But the doctor made it clear that Catherine had it wrong. She was confident that the best way for Catherine to get better was to be treated not by her, not by the doctor's office, but by a therapist. Catherine always considered herself the kind of person who speaks up for herself. If someone didn't take her seriously, it made her angry, and she often said so. But this time, as a tired new mom in a hospital gown that didn't quite cover her back, Catherine just fell silent. She thanked the doctor for her concern and then just got up and left. The next day, Catherine was at home playing with Jade on a mat next to the couch. She was dressed in her workout clothes and waiting for a babysitter to arrive. Even though she still felt achy and exhausted basically all of the time, she was determined to get back to the gym. She'd felt good working out while she recovered from mastitis, so she hoped that some gentle exercise would help her get her body back under control. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. Catherine let in the babysitter and kissed Jade goodbye. Then she slowly headed out to her car to drive to the gym. Once she got there, the familiar sounds of clattering gym equipment and people working out boosted Catherine's spirits. She felt a surge of energy just watching everyone else lift weights and pedal stationary bikes. Catherine took some deep breaths and carefully stepped onto a treadmill. She set the machine to a moderate walking pace and started out slowly, savoring the feeling of movement after weeks of basically being inactive. She told herself it was mind over matter, but after a few minutes, she felt a tingling sensation in her legs and a shooting pain running down her left arm. Catherine kept walking and tried to ignore the pain, but it was no use. Her body was screaming at her to stop. So eventually she pushed the stop button on the treadmill and headed to a bench. She sat down and began massaging her muscles, but that didn't help. Catherine shook her head in frustration. She had barely begun to work out, and now she was already in so much pain that she needed to grab her gym bag and head home. But when she stood up to leave, she felt yet another strange sensation, an intense itching, and it was coming from inside of her chest. Because Catherine could not literally itch the inside of her chest, she reflexively just began tapping on the middle of her chest with her hand, but the itching feeling didn't go away. And so Catherine tapped harder, and then finally she made a fist and just started banging on her chest. But she still felt this unbearable tingling sensation rising up under her skin. Other people now were staring at her as she pounded away madly at her chest. Finally, she dropped her fist in embarrassment when she realized everybody was staring at her, and then as quick as she could, she grabbed her things and headed out of the gym back to her car. Catherine felt helpless. Her whole body seemed to just be falling apart. She knew she needed more help. Maybe a different doctor would have a better diagnosis than her OBGYN, who seemed convinced that it was all in Catherine's head. As soon as Catherine got back home, she made an appointment with her primary care doctor. A few days later, Catherine sat on yet another examination table, this one in her primary care doctor's office. She described her original fatigue and muscle aches and bleeding nipples, but she made it clear her condition was really getting worse and worse. Now she was suffering from weakness and tingling in her limbs, and this weird constant itching inside of her chest. And Catherine was happy to see that her doctor was taking detailed notes as she spoke, and he had a focused, interested expression on his face. When she was finally done speaking, her doctor tapped his pen on his clipboard for a moment, and then he gave her a serious look. He told her he thought she had something called fibromyalgia, which is a disorder that causes pain and tenderness throughout the body and often results in fatigue. Scientists don't fully understand what causes it, he admitted, and there are no real tests for it either. Doctors tend to diagnose patients with the condition when they can't find another explanation for widespread chronic body aches. And although Catherine's doctor didn't actually say this to her, it is the case that doctors will sometimes default to this vague diagnosis, fibromyalgia, when they basically think it could actually all be in the patient's head, just like Catherine's OBGYN had suggested. Catherine's primary care doctor told Catherine that there's no cure for fibromyalgia. He said the best he could do was prescribe her a painkiller called OxyContin to help manage the symptoms. And so Catherine was relieved to finally hear that something was physically wrong with her, even though it was frightening to hear that there was no cure. But still, it didn't seem like all of her symptoms could be explained away by this fibromyalgia. And so Catherine asked if there were any more tests he could run or anything he could do at all to try to figure out any of the underlying reasons behind her pain. But the doctor shook his head and said no, and then stood up to end the appointment. He said the OxyContin would help her feel better, and that was the best he could do. And so as Catherine left his office, she started to feel like, once again, a doctor was casually writing off her symptoms rather than seriously looking into the root cause. She didn't know if she believed the fibromyalgia diagnosis any more than the postpartum depression diagnosis, and she wasn't sure she wanted to start taking OxyContin, which can be very addictive. Because even if it did help mask her symptoms, she knew it wouldn't actually help cure the underlying reason behind them. She wanted a cure, not just a temporary fix. Still, Catherine was enough of a dutiful patient that she did go to the pharmacy and she picked up the 4 pill bottles that were waiting for her, just in case. 2 months later, Catherine laid on the couch, completely exhausted. She had decided to follow her intuition and not take the OxyContin, but now her symptoms were getting so much worse. The aches were deeper in her muscles, the joint pain felt hotter and sharper, the numbness, tingling, and itching inside of her chest were nearly constant. On top of that, she was getting more tired than ever. She had just put Jade to bed, and now she didn't even have the energy to make dinner. So John was heating up some leftover pizza for them to eat. Catherine eventually heard the beep of the microwave, and so she dragged herself out to the kitchen. She winced in pain as she sat at the table while John silently served them their food. Catherine could tell he was mad, but she didn't really know what to say, so she just sat there quietly while they ate, and then she got up to do the dishes. But Catherine was in so much pain that she had to grip the side of the counter for support. John watched her silently and just shook his head. Then he told her that she had been complaining of aches and weakness for months, but she refused to do anything about it. 2 doctors had given her a diagnosis, but she had just rejected both and refused to follow their advice. He was exhausted too, and at his wits' end, trying to understand what was going on with his wife. In fact, he wasn't even sure there was anything actually wrong with her. Before she could say anything, John turned and walked out of the room. Catherine stood at the counter for another minute and then stumbled to a kitchen chair and just sat there crying for what felt like hours. Finally, she stopped crying and dried her face off with a napkin and told herself that she couldn't give up yet. Maybe there was still an answer for her out there, and even if she didn't have her husband's support, she'd continue to look for answers alone. She had to keep trying for Jade. A few months later, in the spring of 1999, Catherine finally got an appointment with a rheumatologist who was an expert both on fibromyalgia and arthritis. Since that fight with John in the kitchen, Catherine had gone out and seen various other doctors, but none of them had been able to help. But now, as she waited in this latest exam room, she felt hopeful that this specialist could solve her case once and for all. After a short wait, the doctor came in. He was an older man, and although he seemed like he knew what he was doing, she didn't like the way he called Catherine honey. She decided she would forgive his sexism if he could offer her something besides addictive painkillers as a solution. And he did. The doctor began scolding Catherine for not listening to what doctors had already told her. The problem is in your head. He had reviewed her charts, and as far as he was concerned, she didn't have a disease. And until she could accept that and get herself together, her personal life would continue to suffer. Partway through the doctor's lecture, Catherine just stopped listening, like when she was getting scolded as a kid. She felt humiliated and desperate and mad. She knew there was something physically wrong with her, but she was now starting to feel her will to fight slipping away. And she knew the doctor was right about one thing. Her marriage was crumbling under the weight of her sickness. Catherine pushed herself up from her chair and silently left the office. She walked slowly to her car, having to stop periodically to lean against the wall to rest. When Catherine got home, she paid the babysitter and put Jade in the playpen in the living room. Then she lay down on the couch and watched as her little daughter crawled around the space. Jade was nearly 1 year old, and Catherine loved to see her blossoming into a little toddler. But watching from the couch also made Catherine feel guilty and totally inadequate. She wanted to play with her little girl and crawl around on the floor with her, but she just couldn't. Catherine told Jade how beautiful and special she was, but to her surprise, the words that came out of her mouth sounded funny, almost like she was drunk. She sat up straight and tried to speak normally, but again, the words that tumbled out were ragged and slow. And so Catherine thought to herself, oh my God, I can't even talk anymore. Catherine started to feel a rising sense of panic. If her symptoms got much worse, she wouldn't be able to care for her baby at all. As the sun faded, Catherine managed to feed Jade and get her to sleep. She promised herself that she would clean up the baby's mess in the living room, but first she just needed to lay back down on the couch. An hour later, the front door opened and her husband, John, walked in. Catherine was still laying on the couch, tucked underneath a blanket. and she could immediately feel her husband's disapproval as he stared at her and then also at the messy room all around her. John dropped his bag and sat down next to Catherine. He told her enough was enough. It was time to suck it up and get herself together. Catherine felt tears roll down her face, but she didn't have the energy to respond. They'd had this conversation over and over again, and it always arrived at the same place, with John not believing her. And she just did not have the energy to fight anymore. So she just laid there, letting tears stream down her face. John didn't say anything more either. After a minute, he just got up and left. As Catherine lay there alone, she felt something shift inside of her. She'd been fighting with her doctors, her husband, and her body for months. She realized that she'd gotten to the end of her rope. After 10 months of fighting, she felt hopeless, alone, and totally out of options. Catherine could not keep living like this. That night, Catherine dragged herself into the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet to get her toothbrush. Her 4 unopened bottles of OxyContin were standing on the glass shelf. She realized the pills would be more than enough to end her life. Catherine closed the cabinet, hobbled over to the bed, and crawled under the covers. As she tossed and turned, she kept thinking about those bottles of OxyContin. She looked over at John, who was sound asleep. She didn't want to leave him and Jade alone, but she just couldn't bear the pain anymore. She was done. Tonight, she would sleep beside her husband for the last time. The next day, she'd make sure Jade was with someone, and while John was at law school, she would overdose on her pills. Catherine closed her eyes, satisfied that she finally had a plan. Then she fell into a deep sleep. But as she slept, Catherine had a strange dream. A jumble of images flickered through her mind, like some broken film reel. She couldn't make sense of what they meant, and then she heard a voice. It was deep and powerful and cut through all the chaos of her dream. The voice told her that there was something poisonous growing inside of her that needed to come out. Catherine bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. The dream felt so real that suddenly she felt like she could taste poison in her mouth. Catherine suddenly knew that she had just gotten a message that could save her life. The next day, Catherine sat in the waiting room of yet another doctor's office. This time, she was meeting with a surgeon named Susan Kolb. The voice in Catherine's dream had told her that whatever this poison was in her body, it needed to come out, like be surgically removed. And Catherine was almost positive she knew what it was. Now she just needed to convince a surgeon to actually perform the surgery. Catherine described her symptoms to the surgeon for what felt like the millionth time. When she mentioned the shooting pain in her arm, Dr. Kolb stopped her. She said she'd seen those symptoms before, and they weren't caused by postpartum depression or fibromyalgia. Dr. Kolb was pretty sure she knew what was making Catherine sick. It was exactly what the voice in Catherine's dream had said it was. But there was no way to know for sure without actually doing surgery. She needed to visually confirm her diagnosis, and no amount of imaging from MRI or CT scans would be enough. She would have to cut Catherine open in the hope that she was right, exposing her to all the risks of surgery from bleeding to infection to organ damage. Catherine felt a surge of fear and also hope. The prospect of undergoing serious surgery was terrifying, but far less so than the prospect of continuing to get weaker and sicker. So she took a deep breath and told Dr. Kolb to please schedule her for the soonest available time slot. Three days later, Catherine lay on an operating table at a local hospital. Dr. Kolb stood at her side and asked if she had any last questions or doubts before they began the procedure. Catherine confirmed that she didn't, and Dr. Kolb nodded to the anesthesiologist. They stepped forward and put some drugs into Catherine's IV. Dr. Kolb waited until Catherine was in a deep sleep before reaching for her scalpel. Then she made a quick incision in Catherine's skin, revealing the fatty tissue beneath. With precise and careful strokes, she continued to cut deeper and deeper. She kept going until her knife was underneath Catherine's pectoralis major muscle, the largest muscle in the chest. There, Dr. Kolb saw what she was looking for. the round implants from Catherine's breast augmentation surgery 11 years earlier. The implants were in the right position, and they didn't appear to have any holes, which was a common problem with implants. But these were not the issues Dr. Kolb was looking for. She reached down and loosened one of the implants and then pulled it out, and immediately Dr. Kolb was shocked at what she saw. The problem was so obvious, the doctor knew right away she would not need to run any additional tests to confirm her diagnosis. The implant was supposed to be full of clear saline liquid that normally keeps it round and firm, but instead, the liquid inside of Catherine's implant was pitch black and full of tiny floating particles. Dr. Kolb quickly switched to the other side of Catherine's chest and removed the second implant, and it too was also black and full of particles. Dr. Kolb told her astonished surgical team that she had found what was making Catherine sick, and the cause was as shocking as it was unlikely. It would turn out Catherine's breast implants were full of a black mold, the same kind of fungus that grows in people's bathrooms. The contamination probably began about 10 months earlier, right after Catherine's breasts began bleeding as she was feeding Jade. She really did have mastitis then, but the antibiotics that her doctor had given her to treat it had caused a brand new problem. The drugs had cleared up the mastitis, but they did their job almost too well. They also killed healthy bacteria inside of Catherine's body that helped protect against other infections. And so as a result, Catherine soon developed this fungal infection that sneaked into her breast implants through a loose valve or seal. From there, the fungus started breeding inside of the liquid saline of the implants and began releasing a steady stream of poisonous toxins back into Catherine's body that were making her very sick. If Catherine had ignored the warning signs from her body and her powerful dream, the implants could have easily eventually burst and killed her. But she listened to the voice in that dream, and it saved her life. Dr. Kolb put Catherine on a 2-month course of a common antifungal medication called fluconazole. After it was completed, Catherine felt much better. It was a long road to recovery, but eventually, Catherine would feel totally normal. She and John were able to work through the relationship issues that manifested during her illness, and they would actually go on to write a book together about relationships. 2 months after her implants were removed, Catherine became pregnant with her son, Cole. She continues to live a healthy life with no long-term effects from her fungal infection. The FDA now requires that breast implant manufacturers include prominent boxed warnings and updated recommendations designed to detect leaks in the implants. On May 11, 2007, 16-year-old Kevin Haynes practically bounced with excitement on his seat on the bus as he headed home from Manheim Township High School outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. His older sister Maggie had just come home from college the day before, and their dad was going to make his signature spaghetti and meatballs to celebrate her return. And if the Haynes family followed their tradition, they would also rent a family video after dinner and then maybe watch the Philadelphia Phillies baseball game. Kevin thought his Friday night lineup sounded great. Kevin and his sister Maggie were not super close, partly because Maggie was 4 years older, but Kevin looked up to Maggie. She was cool and stylish and so athletic, she actually ran for the Bucknell University track team. And Maggie admired her brother right back, even bragging about him to her college friends. Kevin was a straight-A student in his school's gifted program and a member of the school's Quiz Bowl team, which competed against other high schools to show who was the smartest. And his big sister had plans to make Kevin even better. This summer, she had promised to fix his nerdy fashion sense. She told him no more knee-high white socks with khaki shorts. Kevin chuckled to himself as he rode along at the idea that his sister was going to fix him. He was a very modest young man, his round face turning bright whenever he became the center of attention. And he would never brag. But Kevin knew that he was doing a lot of things right already. He was close to getting his Eagle Scout badge from the Boy Scouts, and he had just passed his driver's test. He was a homebody by nature, but he was emerging as a young man ready to take on the world. The evening before, he had gone to a meeting at his school about a class trip to Germany in July. Kevin's family, like so many in eastern Pennsylvania, traced their ancestry to Germany, and Kevin had always dreamed of visiting. Finally, it was actually happening, and, best of all, his roommate on the trip would be one of his two best friends, Alec Kreider. Now, on the bus, he and Alec chatted excitedly about all the things they planned to do in Berlin, Germany's capital. When Kevin waltzed into the kitchen of his family's neatly kept middle-class home that Friday afternoon, he plopped his backpack down onto a chair and went to the refrigerator to look for a snack. He was daydreaming about Germany and pulling out the blueberry pie when his sister Maggie walked in and reminded him they needed to get Mother's Day cards for their mom. So Kevin wolfed down his pie, and then the pair drove off to a nearby strip mall to shop for cards. Kevin and Maggie often joked about how perfectly boring their family was, comparing themselves to the Cleaver family from the 1950s TV show Leave It to Beaver. Their father, Tom Haynes, was an industrial supply store manager who loved his work, while their mom, Lisa Haynes, taught preschool at a church school. None of them did drugs or drank much alcohol, and neither Kevin nor Maggie had ever had a serious romance. On Sundays, they all went to church. The Haynes family also prided themselves on leaving their doors unlocked, except when they went away for vacation. Their town was on the edge of Amish country, where the straight-laced Amish people still travel in horse-drawn wagons, and crime was so rare that many of their neighbors did the same thing. In Manheim Township, people felt safe. But a boring lifestyle worked just fine for Kevin, Maggie, and their parents. They enjoyed each other's company and looked forward to being together. Both Maggie and Kevin were back at the house by the time their father, Tom, came blazing in promptly at 5 to start getting dinner ready. Tom had recently had surgery for prostate cancer, and he still had a catheter implanted, but you'd never know it by his good cheer and energy. At 5:30, the whole family gathered around the dining room table for pasta and lots of catching up. It was Kevin's mom, Lisa's, last day of preschool, and she had been touched by the gifts that her preschool students had given her. She planned to write notes back to all of her little scholars. Maggie talked about her professors at Bucknell, some she loved, others not so much, and everyone at the table talked about how glad they were that Maggie was home. They had missed her last summer when she stayed at college to work on a biology project. Kevin loved the dinner. His dad had a magic touch with the meatballs. But Kevin didn't love the family movie that night. Maggie and his mother had picked out a romantic comedy at the local video store, and Kevin groaned as soon as his mom pulled it out of the bag. He tried to watch it, but the film seemed sentimental and dumb to him, and he could feel his eyelids drooping about halfway through. So, not long after 9 p.m., Kevin told his family that he loved them, but he needed to go to bed. Maggie teased her brother as he headed for the stairs, saying he might be the only teenager alive going to bed so early. But Kevin didn't mind. He was going to read until he fell asleep. Maggie and her parents watched the rest of the movie. Then Maggie and her father stayed up a bit longer to watch the Philadelphia Phillies beat the Chicago Cubs. By 11, everyone retired to their bedrooms, passing Kevin's darkened room along the hallway. Tom and Lisa quickly fell asleep, but their daughter Maggie was still on a college student schedule. She watched TV programs on her laptop and then chatted online with college friends until she finally nodded off around 1 a.m. An hour later, at a little after 2 a.m., Maggie was suddenly jolted awake by the sound of screaming. There were no words, just the ear-splitting screams of a man along with loud thuds as if people were wrestling, and all these sounds were coming from her brother's bedroom. Totally confused and now trembling with fear, Maggie grabbed her glasses from off the nightstand and stepped into the hallway to investigate. But the terrible noises coming from Kevin's room made her so scared that Maggie just ran back inside her bedroom, slammed the door, and sat with her back pressed against it. She tried desperately to make sense of what was happening amid all the screeching. Was there an intruder in the house who was attacking her brother? And if there was, what hope did she have of preventing the intruder from breaking into her room next? She couldn't just sit there and wait. So Maggie summoned all her courage and ran across the hall to her parents' room where the light was on. Her father was lying motionless while her mother was sitting at the end of the bed, hunched over and crying hysterically. When Lisa Haynes saw her daughter, she told her in a voice barely above a whisper, "Go get help." Maggie didn't need to be told twice. She ran wildly down the stairs and out into the cool spring night, banging on one neighbor's door after another until finally one woman turned on a light and let her inside. Maggie told her that she had no idea what was going on inside of her house, but judging from her mom's hysterics, she feared it had something to do with her father's prostate cancer. And so whatever was going on, Maggie said, we need the police right now. Officer Steve Newman, working the night shift just weeks after finishing the police academy, got to the scene first. He went straight to the neighbor's house where Maggie had made the 911 call. Maggie was teary-eyed and dressed in a sweatshirt decorated with a cartoon penguin, and she was totally confused about what was going on in her house across the street. She said her dad might be having some kind of health crisis, or maybe there was a home invasion going on. When Newman left the neighbor's home and went across the street and rang the doorbell on the Haynes family home, no one answered. So he opened the unlocked door and went inside, mindful that an intruder could be lurking in the darkness. On the first floor, Newman, along with a second officer, saw nothing unusual except that the glass sliding door in the kitchen was open. Otherwise, the house was still. But as Newman climbed the stairs, gun drawn, he saw a spot of blood. Then he saw two more further up. As he reached the top of the stairs, he could see bloody footprints on the hallway carpet, and there, in the doorway of his bedroom, lay Kevin Haynes in his Boy Scout t-shirt, face down in a pool of blood. Newman could see that his throat and face had been severely slashed, while his arms were covered with knife wounds, as though he had put up a desperate fight to live. Both officers continued down the hall to Kevin's parents' room. There, they found Tom Haynes lying on his back on the bed, eyes staring up at the ceiling, deep stab wounds to his chest. At the end of the bed, curled up in the fetal position, lay Lisa Haynes. Lisa was still warm, and for a moment, Newman hoped she might be alive, but then he saw the deep gash on her throat. All three were dead. Detective Alan Lead grabbed the phone on the second ring when the 911 dispatcher called a little after 3 a.m. The 57-year-old detective called himself the old dog of the Manheim Township Police, and he had plenty of experience answering emergency calls in the middle of the night. Bald and bespectacled, Lead could pass for a high school teacher, but in reality, he was a hardened investigator who had just finished investigating a shooting at a local tavern the day before. He was also a veteran of the Vietnam War who had learned a valuable lesson a long time ago: treat people the way you would want to be treated. The other detectives looked up to Lead, and they often went to him for advice about their cases. The dispatcher told Lead that something terrible had happened at 85 Peach Lane. Lead did a double take when he heard the address. Peach Lane was in one of the most peaceful and pleasant neighborhoods in the whole town, an area where police were seldom called. He asked the dispatcher if it was some sort of domestic disturbance, and they just said, "No, that's not what happened. You'd better get over there." Lead knew that the crime scene unit was poring over the crime scene, cataloging all the evidence. They didn't need Lead's help with that. He could check out the scene later. Right now, Lead needed to talk to the only surviving witness, Maggie, and by now, Maggie was on her way to the police station. So Lead got dressed, jumped in his car, and headed into the office. Maggie was already in an interview room talking to another detective when Lead arrived, and the detective excused himself to brief Lead on how it was going. The whole conversation was making him uncomfortable, the detective said. Maggie seemed relaxed and chatty, and she kept talking about her family in the present tense as though they were not dead. The detective said she didn't seem like a woman who had just lost her entire family. Lead looked through the one-way glass into the room where Maggie was still sitting, occasionally looking up and smiling in their direction. Other times, she smoothed her hair and sat with her hands folded on her lap as though she was just awaiting instructions. The other detective was right. She certainly did not seem heartbroken. But Lead said that the most important thing they could do right now would be to get as much information out of Maggie as they could. For all they knew, the killer could be planning to strike again, so time was of the essence. He asked the detective to get a written statement from Maggie that included everything she could remember about the evening, no matter how minor it seemed to her. the tiniest detail could turn out to be a critical clue. So the detectives set Maggie up with a laptop computer and gave her an assignment. Tell us what happened. And Maggie took it to heart, typing page after page about everything that took place since she returned home from college. She wrote about the TV shows she watched and how her parents didn't understand the TV show Grey's Anatomy. She wrote about doing a crossword puzzle with her mother, and she wrote about the score in the Phillies game that she watched. But when Maggie got to the moment that she heard screaming from her brother's bedroom, her account became less and less specific. She never saw the intruder. She didn't realize her parents had both been stabbed even though she was in their bedroom with the lights on, and she never investigated what was causing all the noise in her brother's bedroom. When she needed to describe her reaction to learning that her family was dead, she wrote simply, quote, "and you know the rest," end quote. Lead and the other detectives didn't know what to think. Some details in Maggie's statement were touching, depicting an unusually close family. But it's a basic principle in police investigation that when a witness fills their statement with irrelevant details, they may not be telling the whole story. Lead didn't think of Maggie as a suspect, but it did seem odd that the killings came just 2 days after she returned home from college and that she was miraculously spared. It was also strange that she had seen so little of the loud, bloody attack unfolding all around her in her home. But Lead thought to himself that Maggie's performance was so bad that she had to be telling the truth. After all, if Maggie was connected to the crime in any way, wouldn't she put on a major display of grief to cover her tracks? As dawn broke over Mannheim Township, Lead was facing perhaps the most appalling murder case in his town's history, and he had little more to go on than the quirky personality of the lone survivor. The slaughter of a respectable family in a picture-perfect neighborhood where people leave their doors unlocked was an irresistible story to the national news media. By late on Saturday, May 12th, the same day as the murders, the crime was on CNN and other big national networks, all of them pointing out that the killer or killers were still at large. The people of Mannheim Township were scared that a psychotic killer was on the loose in their community, and police started giving Maggie around-the-clock security protection. For Alan Lead and the other detectives working the case, the media coverage triggered dozens of calls from people who said they knew something about the crime, but almost certainly didn't. One woman called to report 3 Hispanic men in a black Chevy cruising the neighborhood near the crime scene. Perhaps they were involved. A man called to report 2 young people dressed in goth clothing who spit on him. Maybe they were the killers. One couple who called in actually volunteered the use of their bloodhound dog, Nellie, which initially seemed like a smart idea to Lead. So Lead let Nellie sniff blood spatters at the crime scene and then turned her loose. And Nellie took her handlers, as well as the police, on a zigzagging tour of the business district before finally leading them to a burger restaurant that Nellie thought smelled delicious. And it was at this point that her handlers admitted that Nellie very likely had no idea where the Haynes' killer had fled. The police had no solid suspects, but their crime scene investigation at least gave them some clues. It appeared that the killer, or killers, had struck the parents first, then savagely attacked their son, Kevin, leaving blood everywhere, including on the bottom of the killer's shoes. That's what left the bloody footprints in the upstairs hall. If they could find the shoes that matched the prints, they would have their killer. Despite the extreme violence, there was no sign of robbery. Lisa Haynes' jewelry and other valuables in the house were undisturbed. Whoever killed the family had likely targeted them for some reason other than money. And the viciousness of the attack on Kevin specifically made police suspect that Kevin might have been the primary target. There was also one other disturbing detail at the crime scene. They found blood in the downstairs bathroom, as though the killer had taken the time to clean up before leaving the murder scene. Their killer, it seems, was not remotely in a hurry. Maggie's role in all of this, if any, remained a mystery. Almost immediately, rumors spread that a former boyfriend of Maggie's could be the killer, but Maggie had never had a serious boyfriend. Lead asked an FBI analyst to read Maggie's written statement to see if he saw signs of deception about the murders. The analyst said they did not. And so it seemed to Lead that people were gossiping about Maggie mainly because she was the only family member to survive. The police began interviewing everyone who knew the family, hoping that they might gain some insight into who would want to hurt them. But the Haynes family were a tough family to hate. Person after person reported how decent and friendly they all were and how they always tried to do the right thing. Kevin had two best friends, Alec, who he was going to Germany with, and Warren Tobin, who he had known since elementary school and ate lunch with in the school cafeteria most days. These three were so close that they called themselves the Three Musketeers. If anyone would know who might hate Kevin and his family enough to kill them, it would be Alec or Warren. But the detective who called them came away with few concrete leads. Warren, who was choking back tears, said that Kevin got along with everyone. He said Kevin didn't socialize much, but he was always helpful to his classmates and no one seemed to pick on him. Warren said all of the Haynes family members were extremely nice and he couldn't understand why they had been attacked. Kevin was even closer to Alec, who lived just a half-mile away. Not only were they going to Germany together, but they were well known at the high school for their good-natured cafeteria debates about everything from religion to politics. But Alec said he was just as baffled as Warren. When Warren called him on Saturday with the horrible news, Alec said he initially thought Warren was just making a terrible joke. He said he couldn't think of a single person with a bad opinion of Kevin, except for perhaps a couple of students in math class who occasionally teased him. But it seemed like no big deal to Alec. In all their interviews, police found only one trace of ill will towards the Haynes family. One of Tom Haynes' co-workers said that Tom, in his role as a manager, had recently threatened a new employee with firing if his performance didn't improve. The co-worker said the two men got into an angry discussion behind closed doors in Tom's office, but when one of Lead's detectives tracked down this new employee, he denied there had ever been any shouting or even any anger. And he had a perfect alibi. He and his wife were out late with another couple the night of the murders. So it was another dead end. Then, on May 15th, so 3 days after the murders, Lead got a call from an alert trooper in North Carolina who had pulled over two men in their 20s for speeding and then discovered they had been smoking marijuana as well. One of the men volunteered, while high, that they were heading for Florida after, quote, getting away with murder in Pennsylvania, end quote. The trooper was aware of the Haynes family murders, and so he searched this vehicle closely until he found a knife. Both of these men were locked up in the Johnson County Jail, the trooper told Lead, if he wanted to send someone to question them. For the first time in 4 days, Alan Lead felt hopeful, and he practically skipped out of his office into the squad room to tell the other detectives about this new hot lead. He told them how one of these suspects even had lacerations on his right hand. The guy claimed the injury was from a sawmill, but those cuts could also come from violently murdering people. Lead told his team, "We may have our killers." At Lead's request, the FBI had already done an analysis of the bloody footprints in the hallway. They came from size 12 Hush Puppies, a casual shoe brand. So Lead called the Johnson County jailer and asked him to send a photocopy of the soles of the two men's shoes. The jailer was happy to oblige, and a few minutes later, Lead received a fax from North Carolina. The pictures were disappointing. The two men were wearing sneakers, not Hush Puppies, and neither was a size 12. But Lead knew they could still be the killers, so he asked for a DNA sample from both of the jailed men that could be compared with DNA from the crime scene. Once again, the jailer was happy to help, and once again, the results were disappointing. A few days later, the crime lab told Lead that none of the DNA from the men in jail in North Carolina matched the crime scene. They were not the murderers. Feeling very discouraged, Lead thought to himself, maybe they were thinking about this case all wrong. The FBI had told investigators that the murders had the earmarks of a crime by someone who knew their victims, not a crime committed by strangers. The killer or killers had used a knife, which is a very intimate murder weapon, and the attack on Kevin seemed an act of pure hatred. And whoever had done this did seem to know their way around the house, likely knowing that the Haynes did not lock their doors. Maybe, Lead thought to himself, investigators needed to keep looking closer to home. On May 19th, so a week after the murders, people crowded into the Otterbein United Methodist Church for a memorial service for the Haynes family. It was a church that had long been at the center of the family's life. Kevin's grandmother was one of the church's founders, while Tom had served as a trustee. The crowd grew so large that volunteers hastily set up folding chairs at the back of the church to accommodate the overflow. All the while, a Pennsylvania state trooper videotaped everyone coming in the door, and local police were stationed all over the building just in case the killer might reveal themselves. Moments before the service was about to start, Detective Lead escorted Maggie and her other family members into the church, where they somberly took a seat in the front row. The entire chamber immediately fell silent, except for the sobs of Warren Tobin's sister. The pastor spoke about the mystery of evil and the promise of the afterlife for the faithful Tom, Lisa, and Kevin Haynes, providing some comfort amid such a staggering loss. But then the pastor invited Lisa Haynes' brother to the podium, and his message sent a shiver through the entire congregation. He talked about the profound impact the murders were having on the Haynes family, as well as the larger community, and he called on the killer to come forward and ask Maggie for forgiveness. He said the killer might even be here right now at this memorial service, posing as a grieving friend or loved one. For Kevin's friend, Alec, who was seated with the German teacher who would have chaperoned Alec and Kevin to Germany that summer, the message that the killer might be in that room was overwhelming. By the time the service was over, Alec had balled up his fists, his face was glowering, and when several girls tried to comfort Alec and give him a hug, he grew rigid and stepped back. Alex stalked off to his father's car where he sat fuming, and when his dad got in, he asked what was going on. Alex said he was furious at all the hypocrites in the service who never cared about Kevin when he was alive, but now that he was dead, everyone was acting so sad in public like he mattered to them. But he didn't. They didn't care. And in fact, Alec was now convinced, like Lisa Haynes' brother, that the killer had to be one of those hypocrites. They were there in the church. He knew it. By May 22nd, so 10 days after the murder, Lead and his team were no closer to making an arrest, and the detectives were starting to disagree amongst themselves about how to move forward. Several believed that Maggie had not told them everything she knew. Maybe Maggie was not involved in the crime, but she could be holding back details about the family's history or something that happened on the night of the murder that could help them solve the case, and so they wanted to bring Maggie back to the police station for more questioning. Lead didn't like the idea. Maggie had answered their questions over and over again, often giving investigators more details than they really wanted. What more could she have to say? And Lead feared that Maggie might have a serious emotional breakdown if they asked the same questions again as though they didn't believe her earlier answers. But Lead ran the team like a democracy, and when the other detectives outvoted him, he agreed to question Maggie one more time. At 11 a.m. that morning, Lead walked into an interview room and sat down across from a now somewhat resentful Maggie Haynes. But to Lead's surprise, Maggie did have more to say. As Lead asked question after question in his gentlest voice, Maggie energetically responded. As Maggie recalled the unfolding attack on her family, she said she could smell the blood when she stepped from her bedroom out into the hall. When she got to her parents' room, she couldn't see any blood, she said, but her mother was so upset that when she asked her to go get help, Maggie didn't ask any questions. She just went and got help. In the moments after Maggie had learned that her parents and brother were dead, she said the first person she wanted to call was the head of her prayer group at college. She wanted to know why God would let something so terrible happen. And then Maggie started to cry. By the time she walked out of the police station, Alan Lead was convinced of two things. 1, Maggie had nothing to do with the crime. And 2, she had told them everything she knew. Over the next 2 weeks, tips about the Haynes murders continued to come into police, but the results were much the same. They put a microphone on one informant who claimed that a guy named Amani had confessed to invading the Haynes' home and then, quote, taken care of, end quote, the people inside. But after 2 weeks of eavesdropping on Amani's conversations, all police heard about was Amani bragging about women, drugs, and guns. He did not seem to know anything about a triple murder. Meanwhile, one of Kevin's best friends, Alec Kreider, who had become really angry at the memorial service, convinced the killer was amongst them, he started to break down. In the first days after the killing, his parents worried that he was keeping his grief about Kevin's death inside, becoming even more silent and withdrawn than usual. Alec had never had an easy time expressing his feelings, and he didn't have a lot of close friends aside from Kevin and Warren. And then, in early June, 3 weeks after the murder, Alec began talking about suicide on the phone with a girl he had a crush on. Her name was Carolyn. On June 5th, he told Carolyn he had a loaded gun and he didn't think he was going to make it through the week. Carolyn's heart started racing when she heard this because she feared Alec really was going to kill himself, maybe even on the phone with her at that very minute. She managed to get the attention of her aunt who lived with her, and she let her know that she had a suicidal boy on the phone. Carolyn gave her aunt Alex's address and said she had to go there to warn Alex's mother. Carolyn then kept Alec on the phone until her aunt spoke to Alex's mom, and Alex's mom called 911. When Alec finally came out of his bedroom, there were several police officers waiting who tackled him and then handcuffed him to prevent him from hurting himself. Detective Lead had come with the 911 response when he heard the call, in part because he knew Alec better than anyone else in the department from the Haynes investigation. Lead walked next to Alec as he was gently led out of the house towards a squad car, and as he walked, Lead put his arm around Alec and just said, "How are you doing?" And all Alec would say was, "The world is a terrible place." As police helped Alec step into the squad car, Lead thought about the way the murders were totally upending the lives of the people who survived. Lead was convinced that Maggie was on the edge of a breakdown, and now one of Kevin's closest friends was cracking up. He couldn't help but agree with Alec. The world is a terrible place. The next day, on June 6th, Alec was involuntarily committed to a mental hospital to be held for at least a week. For the next 6 days, Alec was kept in a locked ward and not allowed to have any contact with anyone outside of the hospital except for his parents. All the while, Alec wrote letters that he intended to send to Caroline. Finally, on June 12th, Alex's parents were scheduled to come to the hospital for a family therapy session, and Alec was looking forward to seeing them. But Alex's parents had bad news. Carolyn did not want to have a romantic relationship with him. After all the suicide talk and threats of violence, Carolyn's aunt told them that the teen only wanted to be friends, nothing more. The second Alec heard this, he seemed to just crumple in his chair and let out a laugh that was anything but amused. He looked at his parents and told them bluntly to get out of the room. He needed to speak to his therapist alone. The therapist was only in the room with Alec for a few minutes before she emerged looking like she had seen a ghost. She told Alex's parents that Alec really needed to tell them something, and what Alec had to say would blow the Haynes family murder case wide open. Based on what Alec and his parents told investigators, here's what really happened to Tom, Lisa, and Kevin Haynes on the night of June 12th. A little after 1 a.m., the killer got dressed in dark clothes, including a baseball hat with duct tape over the team logo and hush-puppy shoes. Then they grabbed a flashlight and a knife and began the relatively short walk to the Haynes' household. When they got there, the killer knew the door would be unlocked, so they opened it up and silently walked through the house, up the stairs towards the bedrooms. First, the killer went into the parents' room and quickly killed Tom Haynes with 2 deep stab wounds to the chest. The killer also stabbed Lisa Haynes, but she was still alive when the killer left the room. The killer then walked down the hall to Kevin Haynes' room, and he began stabbing him as he slept. But Kevin woke up and began to fight back. Kevin managed to get out of his bed and began crawling towards the door, but the killer caught up to him and then mortally wounded him with a slash to the throat. The screams that woke Maggie up were the sounds of her brother's dying moments. Maggie's appearance in the hall surprised the killer, who didn't realize she'd be home from college. But once she fled to get help, the killer forgot about her and just went back to the parents' room and slashed Lisa's throat, killing her as well. The killer then walked downstairs and casually washed their hands in the bathroom before slipping out the sliding glass door in the kitchen back out into the night. Alec had been carrying his horrendous secret around for weeks until he just couldn't bear it any longer. His rage over what had happened had grown day by day until he couldn't take it anymore and he decided to kill himself. But when he ended up in a mental hospital and got rejected by the girl he liked, Alec realized there were worse things than being dead. With no way to die and nothing to live for, Alec decided he might as well tell the secret. And the secret was that he, Alec, was the killer. Alec offered almost nothing in way of explanation for what he had done. He said only that his best friend, Kevin, had been annoying him lately, chewing too loudly at lunch and arguing a bit too much in their conversations. Alec said that initially he planned only to kill Kevin and smother him with a pillow. But once he got inside the house, he just decided to stab everyone to death. A month later, he told his parents he felt no regrets. In fact, he was still wearing the hush-puppy shoes he wore the night he murdered the Haynes family. All the pieces now fit into place for Detective Lead and his team. Alex's shoes matched the bloody footprints, and police found the flashlight as well as the baseball hat with duct tape over the logo in the woods behind the Haynes' house. They also found a ghastly note in Alex's desk at his house. The note said that Alexander, which is Alex's full name, was born at 3:30 a.m. on May 12th, right after the murders, as though the slaughter had led to Alex's rebirth. Alec pled guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder in 2008, and he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Then, in January of 2014, Alec made good on his suicide threats, hanging himself in his prison cell.
Early on the evening of June 12, 2012, a 25-year-old woman named MrBallen's opened up the door to her hotel room on Phi Phi Island, which is a major tourist destination in Thailand. Once the door was unlocked, Noemi pushed it open, and she held it for her little sister, 20-year-old Audrey, who came in wheeling all their suitcases. Noemi and Audrey were both from Quebec, Canada, and they were also both college students, and they were on this big month-long vacation to celebrate the end of the school year. They had been in Vietnam for the past 3 weeks, and today they had arrived in Thailand, and their plan was to stay here for a bit before finally heading back to Quebec. But for right now, Noemi in particular was feeling really exhausted. I mean, there was a lot of travel getting here today, and the past 3 weeks had been loads of travel, and Noemi was kind of hitting a wall. And so as soon as she got into the room, all she really wanted to do was just flop down on the bed and just lay there for a little while. But she had also become a fairly experienced traveler by this point, and she knew before she did that, she just wanted to make sure that, the bed was cleanly, make sure there were no bed bugs or, unclean sheets or something. And so she went over and pulled the sheets back and checked, and the sheets were pristine. It was beautiful. The room felt super nice. And so she just flopped down on the bed and just enjoyed the air conditioning. And at the same time that she was doing this, Audrey, who very likely was also feeling all the symptoms of travel over so many weeks, she likely was very, very tired, but she, instead of laying down, went right into the bathroom and started getting ready for the night. And Noemi sort of understood why. So while the girls were in Vietnam, they had met these 2 really nice guys who were from Brazil, and they had kind of hit it off, and they had left today to go to Thailand, and wouldn't you know it, it turned out those guys, their itinerary included them coming to Thailand today. And so it was kind of like this revelation at the end of their time in Vietnam that they would not have to say goodbye basically forever, but instead, the good times could keep on rolling in Thailand. And so the plan was that night they would meet up with these 2 guys, these Brazilian guys, out on the beach and basically party with them and just have a fun night. Now, Noemi was looking forward to this night out with these 2 guys, but she also had a little bit of apprehension about it. These guys were perfectly nice, and she and her sister had spent time with them in Vietnam, and really things had been fine. But, Noemi felt like Audrey was a little bit more naive and sort of like easier to be taken advantage of than she was. She was younger than her by 5 years. And also, when the sisters had gone on this trip, their parents had been really apprehensive about, 2 young women traveling alone together all over the world. They were sort of vulnerable. And so the way Noemi had sort of played it to her parents is, don't worry, I'm the big sister. I'll keep my eye on Audrey. She'll be fine. And Audrey kind of played the role of younger sister and was like, yep, I'll do what my big sister says. And so Noemi sort of felt like she had a responsibility to keep Audrey safe. And so she was feeling a bit apprehensive about whatever they were going to do that night with these guys. It just sort of seemed like things were sort of moving quickly with these two guys, They should have maybe just stopped in Vietnam, but they're here, and so who knows what was going to happen. And so Noemi, as she's laying there and Audrey's getting ready, Noemi decides to just give her parents a call. Because one of the things Noemi had been doing over the past several weeks they'd been on this big vacation is sort of constantly updating her parents to assuage their concerns that anything was wrong, with their two kids. Noemi wanted her parents to see that she was doing everything she could, to keep her and her sister safe. And so she pulled out her phone and she was about to call her parents when suddenly Audrey appeared from the bathroom and said, "Stop." And she told her, hey, remember, it's evening for us, but back home in Canada, it's the middle of the night, so you're gonna be waking them up, and they're gonna have loads of questions, like, why are you calling in the middle of the night? And probably you're gonna have to tell them about, how we're going out tonight with these two guys, and they're gonna worry, don't do that. Spare them, we will talk to them tomorrow. They don't need to know what we're doing tonight, everything is fine. And Noemi was thinking, you know what? She's right. This is a bad time to call. Noemi actually forgot, the time change was so significant. And she also, wasn't sure what she would say to her parents about, going out with these two guys because it would raise some red flags. And so Noemi put her phone down and decided, you know what? Tonight's going to be just fine. I just got to let things go. And so she actually climbed off the bed and she joined her sister in the bathroom and began also getting ready for their big night out. A little bit later, Noemi and Audrey left their hotel room and they headed out to the beach. And sure enough, there, right outside of a beachfront bar, were the two Brazilian guys they were meeting up with that night. And as the two girls approached, they saw that each of these guys were holding these big buckets. They almost looked like, a toy that a child would use on the sand, to fill it up and make a sandcastle with, like a big, beach bucket. And, the girls, as they're walking over, they're wondering what these buckets were for, and they thought it was maybe like some joke these guys were gonna play, or they didn't know what. But as they got closer, they realized that these buckets these guys were holding were filled to the brim with ice and liquid. There was some sort of drink in these buckets. And so the girls walked up to them and they said hello, and very quickly the conversation turned to these big drinks they were holding. And Noemi and Audrey were like, what are those? And the guys told them, these are like these amazing cocktails that you can only get in this part of the world. The girls asked, well, what is it? What's inside of the drink? What makes it so special? And the guys kind of looked at each other and laughed, and they're like, I don't know, just try it. It's really good. It'll make you feel great. Now, Noemi, being the sort of more responsible one, did not immediately begin drinking either of these drinks. Instead, she sort of paused and thought about it, but Audrey, on the other hand, was totally sold. She reached forward, grabbed one of the buckets, and just began chugging this drink. And so Noemi's looking at her like, come on, you can't just jump into this. We don't know what this stuff is. But, after a couple of chugs, Audrey lowered the bucket and looked at her sister and she just grinned and she handed it back to her guy. And then she told Noemi, these taste great. This is awesome. You gotta try it. Loosen up. And so at this point, Noemi, she's considering the situation. They were in Vietnam with these guys and these guys were out partying with them. They were drinking with them and, they seemed perfectly trustworthy and they were clearly drinking from these buckets and it didn't seem nefarious. And also, Noemi looked around the beach and suddenly realized that basically everybody had these big buckets, This was not just these two guys. Everybody's drinking this thing. And so Noemi's thinking, okay, well, if they think it's okay and it's sort of normal, in this part of the world, then it's gotta be okay. And so she reached forward, grabbed the other bucket from the other guy, and took a big sip. Several hours later, well after the sun had gone down, Audrey and Noemi were having a great time with their Brazilian friends. They were still near this beachfront bar. They were actually dancing right outside of it because now there was a DJ blaring some music and there were all these people. And actually the sisters had sort of broken up and were sort of doing their own thing with their respective guy, but they were sort of near enough each other that they could kind of keep tabs on each other. And they were just having a great time. By this point, they had jumped in the ocean and gone swimming, they had eaten a ton of local food, and Noemi had lost count of how many of these big bucket drinks they had all consumed together. But they were really just having a blast. Noemi's vision was a bit blurry and she was kind of stumbling and she'd look over at Audrey and she was kind of in the same state, as were the two guys they were with. They're buzzed, they're having a great time. And so the two girls and their guys are just out there dancing, doing their thing. It's about 1 a.m. at this point, and Noemi's guy says to her, "Hey, do you want to head back to the hotel room together?" And Noemi's like, "Yeah, let's go back. But hold on, I want to talk to my sister first." And so Noemi kind of stumbles her way over to Audrey, who's in the middle of this big dance routine with her guy, and she stops Audrey and she whips around, and Audrey's all smiles too. And Noemi's like, "Hey, do you want to go back to the hotel room? We're going back now. Do you want to come?" And Audrey's like, "No, I want to stay here. I'm having too much fun. This is awesome. We're just going to keep on dancing. You guys should stay too." But Noemi was like, "No, I got to go. We're going to go back. So you sure you want to stay?" And Audrey was like, "Yeah, we'll stay. We'll see you at the hotel soon." Now, typically, Noemi and her sister really rarely separated, especially when they were out drinking and partying, because of all the inherent risks of being alone at night, potentially intoxicated. And so, this was kind of a rare thing for her to break away from her sister and separate. But it just seemed like this was okay. It was safe. And, these guys they were with, they really seemed like stand-up guys. And again, they were just having a blast here. And Noemi didn't really want to stop her from having a good time. And so ultimately, she did say bye to her sister and said she'd see her soon. Noemi turned, and with her guy, she headed back to the hotel. And Audrey kept on dancing with her guy in front of the beach bar. 3 days later, on the evening of June 15th, a member of the housekeeping staff at the hotel where Noemi and Audrey were staying walked up to the girls' room and they knocked. And like it had been the past 2 days, they didn't get a response. Because over the past couple of days, the housekeeping staff had not seen anybody come in or out of this room. And now it had gotten to the point where they really had to get in there to clean the room. And basically, if they didn't get a response, this staff member was going to have to unlock the door and just go in there. And so one more time, they knocked on the door and called out, housekeeping, just in case somebody was in there. But again, there was silence. So the staff member put their card into the door, they unlocked it, they opened it up, and stepped inside. And seconds later, that staff member was literally running out of the hotel room, screaming for help. At 9 p.m. that night, a team of police officers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Rat Somboon, arrived at the hotel room. Somboon was an experienced police officer, and he'd already been briefed on what was found inside the hotel room. So when he and his team walked inside and saw it for themselves, he wasn't shocked. When they got in there, they found two women inside. It was Noemi and Audrey Ballanger. And both of them were lying in their respective beds, tucked up in their sheets, lying perfectly still, and each of them was completely surrounded by vomit. Somboon estimated that these two women had been dead for between 12 and 20 hours, and his first theory as to what might have killed them was alcohol poisoning. That would explain the vomit. This was also a big tourist destination, and clearly these people were tourists, and so maybe they were out partying and they died from alcohol poisoning. However, when Somboon looked more closely at the bodies, he noticed a confounding detail. There was all this dried blood on the girls' gums and also under their fingernails. And so that was not consistent with alcohol poisoning. And so Somboon thought, okay, well, maybe the reason they have blood in these parts of their body is because those are defensive injuries. Maybe somebody attacked these girls and that's how they've been killed. But after doing a cursory check around the hotel room, there was no sign of a struggle or any sort of break-in or anything like that. And so, if there had been some sort of lethal struggle in here, it certainly didn't show. And so Somboon and his team really didn't have any idea what had happened here. They had some ideas, but clearly they needed more information. Specifically, they needed to do an autopsy and a full toxicology report on both women. That would be the only way to really see what happened here. But that would take time. And so while they waited for those results to come in, Somboon decided that what he would focus on instead is trying to figure out what these girls were doing in the hours before they died. Where were they? What did they eat? What did they drink? And who were they with? Over the next couple of days, Somboon and his team interviewed several of the hotel staff. And from those interviews, they learned that Audrey and Noemi were visiting Thailand from Canada. And on the first night they were here, the two women went out early in the evening, and then one of them came back with some guy, some unidentified man, at 1 a.m. They came back to the hotel. And then at 4 a.m., the other girl came back to the hotel, also with an unidentified man. And so there are Noemi and Audrey and these two unidentified men that are in the hotel room, presumably from 4 a.m. until 6 a.m., when both of these unidentified men left the hotel room together, and the two girls were presumably left inside the hotel room. Lieutenant Somboon reviewed some security footage from the hotel, which confirmed this entire timeline was correct, which meant Somboon really needed to speak to these two unidentified men because they clearly were the last ones to see these girls alive. And so the police department put out an announcement about Noemi and Audrey's deaths, as well as a public call for help in identifying these two unidentified men. And shortly after making this announcement, the police learned that these two men were Brazilian, and unfortunately, they had already left Thailand on their way back to Brazil. And so obviously Brazil is outside of his jurisdiction, and so he had to appeal to Interpol, which is an international police organization, and appeal to them to find these two Brazilian men and interview them. About a week later, Somboon finally got a call from Interpol. They had found these two men and they had interviewed them. And they told Somboon that when they informed these two guys that Noemi and Audrey had died, the two men seemed genuinely shocked. And then when they were asked, why were you so quickly on a flight out of Thailand back to Brazil? They said, no, there's nothing suspicious about it. We already had booked those tickets way in advance. We just got on the flight and left. There's nothing more to it. And so Interpol said they continued to press these guys and asked them, hey, you were the last ones who were with these girls before they died. Tell us about their condition. Tell us how you left them when you left the hotel at 6 a.m. And the two guys, they said, look, they did seem like maybe they were already hungover or sort of sick from, partying the night before. They definitely did seem a little bit down, but they were basically fine. However, Interpol said it was fairly interesting that the two men did admit that following, their night out with Noemi and Audrey, that the next 2 days, they were stuck in bed themselves, totally sick, vomiting, ill. They didn't know what from, but they said they were very, very sick following their encounter with these two girls. Somboon thanked the Interpol officer and then hung up. And even though Somboon couldn't help but feel still pretty suspicious of these two Brazilian guys, he now was thinking, okay, well, if they said they got really sick after, spending time with Noemi and Audrey, maybe what happened here is, all four of them got sick with something, some illness, and the guys survived it and the girls didn't. And so Somboon began to think of, what type of illnesses could they have contracted? And the first thing that Somboon began to think about that could have been an illness that all four of these tourists could have contracted was food poisoning. Tourists come to Thailand and try the local food, and sometimes it makes them really, really sick. In particular, there were two types of food in Thailand that were sort of notorious for giving tourists the worst food poisoning. One of them was a particular type of mushroom, and another was blowfish. And these two items, if your body reacted badly enough to them, it could be lethal. However, when Somboon got back the autopsy reports and the toxicology reports, he realized his theory about food poisoning was definitely wrong. So it would turn out those drinks that the girls had with the guys in those big buckets, they were unique to Thailand. Those are not drinks that are served really anywhere else in the world. And that's because those drinks are just not safe. And for whatever reason, it sort of blossomed in Thailand and it's sort of an accepted thing. But when you hear the ingredients of what's in this drink, you'll understand why it's not like a sanctioned or more popular thing outside of this small part of the world. So there is no alcohol in these big buckets of liquid. Instead, it includes crushed up narcotics, it includes cough syrup and Coca-Cola, and in some cases, pesticide. In fact, specifically DEET, which is the main ingredient in mosquito repellent. And wouldn't you know it, in the reports that Somboon got back, he saw both of these girls clearly had ingested DEET, which again is a highly toxic chemical. However, despite learning this, even though this seemed to be clearly what happened here, this is a DEET poisoning case, Somboon's thinking to himself, how could this have happened? I mean, these drinks, which are called 4x100s, are pretty popular in Thailand, and people are not just turning up dead left and right. It's a dangerous drink, no doubt, but, people do not die with any regularity from drinking it. And so Somboon thought, what must have happened here is whoever mixed this particular batch of 4x100s must have accidentally included too much DEET. And so that would explain how, the two girls died from DEET poisoning, too much DEET in their drinks, and that very likely the guys as well consumed the same batch, which had tons of DEET in it, but, their bodies were able to withstand it and they survived it despite getting very, very sick. And so 9 days after the two girls had died, their bodies were sent from Thailand back to Canada, along with the Thai police's official findings that this was an accidental DEET poisoning. However, when Noemi and Audrey's remains arrived in Canada, they did not go straight to their family. Instead, they went to a leading coroner in Quebec whose name was René Roussel. So by this point, the girls' parents were obviously heartbroken, but more than that, they were furious. The way they found out about the deaths of their daughters was on the media. Despite the fact that the police were immediately called when the girls were found dead, the Thai police did not get in touch with the family. They only got in touch after their investigation was done, and they're like, hey, by the way, your daughters are dead, and it was a DEET poisoning. It is what it is. Good luck. And so the parents felt like, are you kidding me? Like, you didn't loop us in at all? We're spending days trying to get in touch with our daughters, and you knew all along they were already dead? So the parents have no faith, no trust in the Thai police. And then to find out, wait a minute, so they drank this drink that apparently is sold at this beach bar all the time. And oh yeah, it killed them, no big deal. What, there's no warnings at this beach bar about how dangerous this drink is? Shouldn't there be like a tourist warning or something? And also, it's kind of a lazy explanation that, the two guys they were with drank the same poison, but they didn't die just 'cause, and our daughters did. That doesn't add up either. This whole thing feels like laziness, at best, or at worst, a cover-up. Maybe this looks really bad for Thailand that these tourists have died and it could have been prevented. And so the parents felt like we can't just take their explanation at face value. Clearly, something is going on here. Something's wrong. And apparently, the Canadian government felt the same way as the parents. This case was all over the news, and they also felt like, wait a minute, guys, we haven't looked closely enough at this. What's really going on here? And so it was actually the Canadian government who told René Roussel to go ahead and do another autopsy on these girls' remains. Let's really see if it was DEET that killed them, or maybe if it was something else. And when René checked Noemi and Audrey's bodies, she did discover there was DEET in their system. However, not nearly enough to kill them. So while it seemed plainly obvious that yes, they must have consumed those 4x100 drinks, that couldn't have been the thing that actually killed them. However, René didn't find any other poisonous substances in these girls' bodies. There wasn't another explanation. It just showed there was DEET, but that was basically it. And so René, she's thinking there's gotta be some explanation here. And so René really began to do some serious research into this whole case, and eventually she found something. And it horrified her, it horrified the family, it horrified the world. It would turn out, from René Roussel's additional research, Noemi and Audrey were far from the first tourists to die this way in Thailand. Between 2009 and 2015, at least 20 tourists have been found dead under very similar circumstances. Now, René believed that what must have happened here is all these people, including Noemi and Audrey, must have been poisoned, but the common denominator did not appear to be food or drink. It had to be something else that was poisoning them, something that was damaging blood vessels that would account for the blood under the fingernails and the gums, but also metabolized so quickly that after death, this particular poison could not be detected. And René figured out she was correct. So when Noemi and Audrey first arrived in Thailand, they went to their hotel room, and one of the first things that Noemi did is she pulled back her sheets to check for bed bugs. She wanted to make sure her bed was clean before she laid down and relaxed. And when she looked, it appeared clean. And it was because the sheets were clean. They had actually just been treated for bed bugs, so there were no bed bugs. However, the way this hotel and other hotels, not just in Thailand, but in other parts of the world, the way they were treating for bed bugs was by spraying the sheets with pesticide, specifically phosphine gas, which is highly toxic to bed bugs, so it gets rid of the bed bugs, but it's also highly toxic to people. For reference, it is illegal to do this. You're not allowed to spray sheets with pesticide. And so based on all the evidence, it's believed that what actually happened to Noemi, Audrey, and the two Brazilian men they were with is that they climbed into those beds on the night they came back, and the men were in there with them for some time, and all 4 of them were being exposed to this phosphine gas. It was going in through their skin, they were breathing it in, and they likely had no idea. And so they're getting sicker and sicker. And then finally, the 2 men, they get up out of the beds and they leave at 6 a.m. They've now been, totally contaminated by this poison, but not enough to kill them. So they go home, and over the next couple of days, they get really sick from their exposure to this gas. But Audrey and Noemi, they didn't leave their bed. They stayed in those beds all night. And unfortunately, as they laid there, their bodies continued soaking in all of this poison, and their bodies just could not handle it. And so it eventually killed them. But despite learning this, and despite the fact that clearly something illegal was done here, you cannot spray your bed sheets in a hotel with pesticide to get rid of the bed bugs. It's incredibly hazardous. You can't do it. Despite that, to this day, no one has been held accountable for these girls' deaths.
We weren't born blood, but the bond runs deeper than vein. Signed a contract with silence, swore we weather the pain. Remember that night, cold and black, the clock striking 3. You took the blame for my mistake, kept the spotlight off me. That's the code, man, the unwritten law of the street. When the world turns icy, we supply the thermal heat. I've seen friends fold faster than the cheap paper cup, but when the pressure mounted, you were the one lifting me up. Shared the last dollar, split the final crust of bread. Believed in the vision when the doubters shook their head. You stood in the crossfire, never flinched, never swayed. That's the true currency, the loyalty.
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone,